Hello, everybody. Welcome to Fireside Chat number 7. Theryn versus Kevin, round 1. Uh, I have with us a couple of guests. I'm going to go ahead and introduce them. But by the way, I'm Brian Martinez. Uh, First, we have Theryn Meyer. Is that correct? Am I saying the last name right?
Yes, that's
Oh,
perfect.
okay. And Kevin Logan. Say hello,
Hello
Kevin.
there.
Hello. And yeah, we're just going to get right into it. So we're just basically talking about some stuff. Let's see, we want to hear a little bit about Theryn. I met her at GG in BC. She's very cool. Go ahead, Theryn. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are interested in where my accent's from. I'm originally from South Africa. I'm currently living in Vancouver. I consider myself a men's rights activist. I guess in part because that's a lot of the work that I'm doing currently. I am the president of the Simon Fraser Advocacy for Men and Boys Club at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, and I do spend a lot of my time studying and trying to understand gender better and kind of trying to, um, how do you call it, uh, depropagandize myself in a way, trying to really understand at the core what's really going on. And I also try to uh, open people up to trans issues and just the whole idea of transgenderism. And I try to use as much of base it in reason and philosophy as much as possible. And I have a YouTube channel and I discuss men's rights, trans stuff, and feminism for the most part. I work with Students for Liberty, which is a libertarian student organization here in the US and in Canada. So yeah, that's my sort of background. Yeah,
All
Kevin,
right.
is that?
Yeah, I was fascinated by you as an example because one of the reasons I decided to come on and have these discussions on Honey Badger Radio was I was fascinated by female MRAs, and your story is even more interesting really as a trans MRA. I think you're almost unique. I would suggest, certainly from my experience in that. And I was just wondering how you deal with, and you don't necessarily have to answer quite to all of the MRAs, of course, but the
Mhm.
transphobia within parts of the men's rights sphere.
Well, I agree with you. I don't think you asked a question, but you also made a statement that there's transphobia in the men's rights community, and I totally agree with you. There really is. It doesn't bother me too much. I think there's a lot of simple ignorance. I think a lot of people see it as like a political tool of progressivism, and there's some truth to that, I guess. Um, but some of the discussions I've had um, with, I guess, MRAs, and I don't even know if they call themselves MRAs, but they're certainly commenting and making statements on blogs and forums, on men's rights blogs and forums. I I um, I have a pretty high success rate of opening their minds and using logic and reason. Half of them are just hateful, and the other half are just ignorant and kind of angry at just the idea of transgenderism because they don't know any trans people, so there's this us versus them mentality that kind of uh, capital O, they kind of other trans people in that sense, um, and see it as simply a political, this kind of ephemeral thing. They don't realize that they're actually human beings who are trans. They don't. I mean, they know it, but they don't like realize it. And then they meet me, and they see I'm a reasonable person, and I I base my arguments and facts and philosophy not just ad hominems and like, well, you should call me she just because, or you should just accept trans people because otherwise you're a bigot and you're hateful. I don't really ever approach it that way. Um, I try and approach it as logically as possible, and I often just direct them to the videos I've done on it. I've actually only done one video, but I think it's a helpful video, and I have directed people towards it, and then they're like, you kind of made me think about it. You haven't quite convinced me, but you've opened my mind to the possibility, and I'll definitely think about it. So I think that's great, and I think there's no use in just getting angry and just joining in and calling names. I try to be as understanding as possible, I guess. Yeah.
I have a question too. I want to pose a couple of them actually. You, Theryn, mentioned earlier you wanted to, and maybe it was for lack of a better term, depropagandize yourself. Is that did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
And okay, so my question is, what do you mean by that? Just so that we're all on the same page. Like, what does that mean to you? I guess.
I think it means the same as kind of the mission statement of Honey Badger Radio in a sense, and what Alison talks about a lot is just the narratives that we're all kind of feminist, all of us. Like, even if you don't call yourself one, you've been sold the idea that women are oppressed and men are not, and men have it easier, and we should take care of women, and they can't take care of themselves, and we have all of those things. So we're all a little bit feminist, even though some of my biggest heroes are feminists, like Camille Paglia and Wendy McElroy. So that's what I mean. I try to really get at the core of it, whilst at the same time trying to advocate in my life for the practical stuff, for the issues at hand, while still kind of trying to get at the core of everything.
So would you suggest then, Theryn, that you've been, or not necessarily you personally, but trans people in general are used to some degree as possibly propaganda, and by whom?
I think that trans people are actually, they're more they're exploited to an extent, because trans people don't have it easy, obviously. I think we can all agree on that. But then it seems like at this point of vulnerability, and I find feminists doing this a lot, but in this moment of vulnerability that trans people have, they're kind of swept up by all of the politics, and they really politicize themselves and their identities and their experiences. Whereas, to me, in my opinion, transgenderism should be nothing more than a personal experience. I don't expect anyone at the end of the day to understand the complexity of like how I identify or whatever. That's my personal experience. It doesn't have to do with anyone. I just want people to use the right pronoun, use the right name, and for the most part, just treat me like an individual, like you would treat anyone else, really. So yeah, the politics is really toxic, in my opinion, to trans people.
Well, this is a point I've talked with Alison about politicising women's issues as well. You say that you want it to just be a personal experience, and in an ideal world, it would be, of course. The reason that politics have to be brought into it, because as we've discussed, it's not just within the men's rights movement, of course, but transphobia is still a pretty significant issue. And so I don't see how you can't bring politics into it when you have people, like you say, you want people to use the right nouns or whatever, but there are people who obdurately refuse to do so because they either despise it or just don't accept that trans people are what they say they are.
Yeah, sure. I don't think that that's quite what I mean. I don't mean that there shouldn't be politics involved and that we shouldn't fight for like trans rights and trans issues. But there's a difference between that and like internalizing the politics and politicizing your identity. I find trans people very often they can't separate the two. They literally can't separate the personal from the political. Like the personal is political. Like them being trans is some political act. That's what I mean.
Well, to a degree, it sort of is because it's so taboo, really. And it's like, as you say, it shouldn't be. It should just be a personal thing someone does, and it's barely commented on. It should just be an everyday thing. but it isn't. So in that sense, you are, even though you're just following your natural inclinations, of course, you're going against the grain of a lot of what society thinks. So I don't see, even just purely on a sort of pop psychology level of self-protection from the point of view of your own mental state, it would seem the natural thing to do to essentially take that political mantle on as in terms of your personal experience, because essentially the rest of society treats it that way. So why would you not try and defend yourself, in essence?
Well, I would love to think that trans people politicize themselves as a way of protecting themselves, but they don't. They do it as a way of gaining victim points. So I wouldn't say that that's necessarily why. It's more about it's about the kind of idea, like how do I say it? I talked about this in a previous episode. I had this friend or acquaintance rather who was completely female presenting, so completely female presenting, and she went by the pronoun Z, and I was like, I can't say that. And
the pronoun
she,
Z, did you say?
Z.
Z, as in the letter?
Z-E. Z, zer, zem.
Oh, okay, right.
And insisted that I call her by that pronoun, and she had a female name and everything, and it was so clearly like a political act, and obviously she's like the extreme, but it was so obviously a political act of like, gender is just a social construct designed by like the capitalist white supremacist heteropatriarchy, cisnormative heteropatriarchy, and I'm going to use my personal identity to make a statement or fight against it. I'm going to use my personal experience, whether it's even an authentic experience, but my personal identity, I'm going to use that as a political tool. And I see trans people doing this all the time. I'm sure there's a not more than just a grain of true personal experience, but there's this whole cloud of politics of like, I'm not just an individual, I am a tool for, smashing the white supremacist capitalist cisnormative heteropatriarchy,
But is this not essentially aping, going on the same lines of so many other of the kind of social progressive movements of the past, like gay liberation or the civil rights struggle or whatever? Essentially, a lot of those people acted in exactly the same way and got results. So I don't see that that's necessarily, even though it might be distasteful to you, it might actually be a useful way forward, surely. I mean, I'm speaking as an outsider, so I can't be certain of it. But it seems like it's essentially mimicking the great civil rights sort of movements of the past, really.
Could you elaborate on that parallel?
Yeah, well, with gay liberation, which is something I know is something I mean, I'm heterosexual, but I've read a lot about that, and essentially it was you have trailblazers in essence who go out there and literally are as gay as they could possibly be, to put it in people's faces and say, look, this is a thing that exists. And they essentially politicised themselves, and as distasteful as it may have been to a lot of people even within the gay community, it puts that thing on the map. And the same with black people, with say with Rosa Parks refusing to get up out of the seat, essentially politicising the very fact that she was black and being asked to perform certain functions within society. And essentially, it seems to me, and again, I'm from looking at it from the outside, that the trans people you're talking about here are mimicking that same sort of in-your-face fight back against an actual problem,
Well, I would firstly say that I think A great deal of it is not an actual problem, at least from my experience. A lot of it is an imagined problem. That doesn't mean that what is the problem is not a serious problem. But I don't think, from my experience, it doesn't work. Like, it doesn't. People do not get persuaded or become accepting or whatever when you tell them that I prefer the pronoun Z, and if you don't call me by that and you don't recognize my pan-gender on Mondays and agender on Thursdays, and freaking bi-gender during week. If you don't accept all of that, then you're a transphobe and you're a bigot. That doesn't work from my experience. From my experience, being being kind of moderate about it, being logical and philosophical about it, that's what works. That's how I have convinced people or persuaded people and changes people's minds. Not by doing that. People seem to react really badly to it, especially because, like, I don't know, transgenderism it's a tough topic. It's really hard for people to really understand it. It's really hard for them to come to grips with it. So from my experience, it doesn't work, and it actually makes people more irritated, or not more irritated, but less accepting. Like if you think about how everyone absolutely despises Tumblr, you know, and
Yeah.
I don't know. From my experience, it makes it seem like it's just a joke.
Yeah, but it seems very strange to me that as you yourself as a men's rights advocate would argue that the path to success lies in moderation, because I see so little moderation from a great many people within the men's rights community, and I wonder why it is that you would consider yourself a part of that movement when you just, at least in theory, dismantle the very core of their activist mentality.
Well, no, let me rephrase it better. I guess not moderate, but through different means, and they don't have to be moderate. Like, you can be rational, philosophical, fact-based, reasonable, and at the same time be radical or extreme in your views. And extreme is a relative term. Like, I'm extreme in my views because relative to most people's views, it's totally different. But that doesn't mean I'm not peaceful, reasonable, rational, evidence-based, fact-based, all of those things. So that's what I mean. So moderate is maybe not the. I'd rather say reasonable.
Well, again, but I would counter that with exactly the same point, but replacing the word moderate with reasonable, because I don't see, unfortunately, certainly from the experiences I've had with dealing with a lot of MRAs, I don't see a lot of reasonableness there either. I see a lot of irrationality and I see a lot of anger, but I don't see a lot of reason. And that's not to say there aren't any, because I've done lots of these discussions with very reasonable people, and I'm glad I've met a lot of those people, because they do show another side of that movement, but unfortunately it's the side that doesn't get heard very often.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm trying to change, right? I'm trying to be one of the reasonable people, and I'm hearing an echo.
Yeah, it looks like there's an echo coming from Kevin's end. I'm going to mute you for a second. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. No, there's I agree. There's definitely a lot of irrationality, especially in, like, when you go look at, like, I don't know, comment sections, just kind of people on the ground, not the people being listened to, but the people listening. There definitely is some rationality and irrationality and some level of butthurtness, I guess. But for the most part, from my experience, there are some amazing people in the men's rights movement. I mean, Honey Badger Radio, the listeners of Honey Badger Radio, they're fantastic. They're, from my experience, some of the best audiences.
Can I also? I want to ask a question too.
Yeah.
earlier in the program, like right at the beginning, Theryn, you were asked about your experiences with transphobia in the MRM. And you mentioned that you did experience some. I would ask you this, and this is just like I'm just kind of trying to broaden it. First off, what is the definition of transphobia to you? Because we know that we live in a time where a lot of these kind of bigoted accusations often come with very, very broad definitions where they can be very easily attributed. And I wonder where you see it, how you view it, because I know that for you it's got to be a specific kind of experience. So I'd like to know what that is so that we're all seeing this in the same way that you do. And then the second thing is that is the MRM really unique in that you've experienced this, within that group. You know what I'm saying? Like, have you seen this in other groups as well, or even people who are not groups? It's just like sort of human nature. If you could expand on that, do you follow what I'm saying?
Yeah. I guess I'll try my best to explain what I experience or view as transphobia. I obviously have a much more conservative and, in my opinion, reasonable view of transphobia. I don't think it's people who are ignorant about trans issues. I think it's more people who go out of their way to say nasty things, I guess, or like they would like comment on, like they would go look at my profile picture and tell me, yeah, you're obviously a man, look at your masculine features, don't try and pretend. Like that's in my opinion pretty transphobic.
Yeah. Do you remember the thing that happened with do you know who Ben Shapiro is?
Mm-hmm.
And he was on a talk show with a a trans person named Zoe Tur, and
Mm-hmm.
he said some things that antagonized Zoe Tur. Would you consider what he said transphobic?
Well, firstly, I wouldn't say anything that he said comes even remotely close to the level of unacceptability of how she reacted. Um, it just encapsulates how incapable, in my opinion, the left, or at least the extreme or progressive left, is totally incapable of making a reasonable, peaceful, and rational counter-argument. But in terms of what he said, I think it's a little bit it's borderline transphobic to call her sir. You don't have to. That's just a little bit unreasonable, but maybe not transphobic. But it's a little rude.
He was being. I think he was being a provocateur. Basically, he was trying to upset.
Can I step in at this point? I have to, and again, I feel bad because I'm an outsider to the trans world, of course, but I have to say, and again, I agree that Zoe overreacted enormously, and you shouldn't ever threaten physical violence. That's out of order. But what he was saying was incredibly antagonistic and transphobic, I would suggest. He was deliberately calling people who identify as women men. Now that is absolutely wrong. I'm sorry, as far as I'm concerned, that's incredibly transphobic.
The reason I don't think it's incredibly transphobic is because he made a rational argument. So even though I don't agree with him, and even though I can make an even better argument against him, I think he was at least trying to be more rational. And yes, he was being a provocateur. And I think deliberately calling someone he is certainly rude, and sure, that's transphobic. I will give it that, but I guess I'm conservative over that term because I've been seeing it overused so fucking much.
Well,
yeah. So
it might well be overused, but I think in this case it's absolutely correct because I don't see that outside of, as you said, attacks on physical appearance. I don't see that you can do anything more sort of disgusting than undermining someone's very gender identity in that way, in a way that you know. And it's not just, I mean, provocateur is the technical definition is apt in this sense, but I think you can go further and say he was just being a fucking dick about it. He wasn't just being a provocateur, he was being genuinely outwardly offensive and knowing that's what he was doing. And frankly, as much as I like to say, you shouldn't threaten violence, ultimately, you kind of think to yourself, well, I'm sorry, mate, if you're going to do that, occasionally someone's going to turn around and get angry at you because you're deliberately trying to make them angry, you know?
Wait, I got to ask. Well, hold on a second. I'm getting an echo here. Do you think that it really is the worst thing to address someone by their improper pronoun and then the fact that they threaten you with violence is somehow not as bad?
Well, I would agree.
I'm not saying that either is right. I'm just saying.
Yeah. No, I
no, hyperbolic.
Yeah. No. Well. Yeah. I'm not suggesting it's the worst thing, but in terms of just speech alone, I think it's probably the second worst thing you can do to a person, really, or well, to someone who obviously has gender identity issues or has had in the past or whatever. I think it's incredibly. It goes beyond just rude to outright offensive to do something like that. And I'm not trying to justify her reaction in any way whatsoever. I'm just saying, in general, in life, if you go around pissing people off, people are going to get pissed off at you.
The reason I'm hesitant to call it transphobic is, recall what he said in the beginning when one of the other people on the panel was like, "Oh, it's she. You're being disrespectful. You should call her she." And he was like, "Well, it's not about disrespect. Facts don't care about your feelings." So he kind of had the logical upper hand, and he had the argumentative upper hand. If I were there, he wouldn't have the argumentative upper hand. Point is, they didn't give him any reason not to call her he. He had the logical upper hand. So
he was just being a belligerent. He was just being a belligerent child about it then, knowing that he was offending people. He didn't care because what? Because the people he was up against were his intellectual inferiors in some way.
I guess, but.
Well, that seems to me.
You're a dick, but yeah, sure. That's kind of dickish to do. But as I said, like, he still had the logical upper hand. He still had in the argument, he had the upper hand. None of those people there gave me a reason not to call Zoe he. I mean, I have many reasons myself, and if I were there, as I said, he would not have the upper hand, and he will have his ass handed to him. But as I said, that's why I'm hesitant to call it transphobic, because he wasn't just throwing out names for the sake. Even though he was obviously being a provocateur, he at least had some logic behind it. Does that make any sense? Like, he had some.
To me, that doesn't make any sense, because it seems like you want to have your cake and eat it on this occasion. That basically you're saying, yes, okay, admittedly he was out to provoke people, but he wasn't, he wasn't actually transphobic. And in what sense could
because if facts are provocative, then so fucking be it. If logic is provocative, that is not his problem.
That seems like a very, very inhuman approach to things, to be honest. There's a difference between, I'm not saying that he should lie, but if you can basically not be a dick and not lie, which he could have done, because if he was to...
He has no moral obligation to be a nice person.
No, he doesn't, but I can call him out for being a prick when he's being a prick.
Yeah, but you can't call him transphobic.
Yes, I absolutely can. If he's going out to deliberately insult somebody about their gender when they're transgender, that's transphobic. I don't see how you can see it any other way, frankly. If someone's going out to use insensitive racial language about a racial minority, you would call it racist, and I don't see why you wouldn't do the same for transphobic.
Yeah, but if I don't know, if I,
Go ahead. I just you were getting some feedback. Theryn? Theryn? You're muted. I don't know if we can hear
Oh,
you.
sorry.
No, it's all right.
Um, I am very hesitant to calling people transphobic or whatever when they bring facts and logic to a discussion. That is really worrisome. Uh,
Let,
so yeah,
let me
that is where I'll settle it.
yeah,
I
let me
don't
ask.
think he was in the right, but I don't think they were really in the right either because they didn't really prove themselves like the other side of the argument.
Well, I mean, they were essentially coming from the side of being more
Accept me or
empathic.
you're a bigot. Like,
Yeah, they were approaching it from that end, but the point of the panel was to have a discussion about uh, trans people, right? And Ben was essentially playing the devil's advocate because most of the other people on the panel were all on the same side of the argument. So Ben Shapiro was brought on to be the let's say, essentially he was supposed to be the other side, but he was alone. And yeah, he probably overcompensated, and sure, he probably saw it as an opportunity to like kick up some shit. Um, but I think, and I don't want to, I'm not trying to make anyone's arguments for them here, but I think that the thing is that they never, as far as I knew, they never got into the real part of the discussion because Ben was saying the argument he wanted to make was that there was that we were entertaining a delusion and that there was like there was science that he had on his side that showed that people who went in and got their sex changes would they would end up in many cases depressed, or the suicide rates wouldn't change, they'd go up or whatever, and there was no one that was bringing any evidence to the contrary.
mhm.
They just didn't like what he was saying.
Yeah,
And
exactly. And I'm sorry, but facts are not transphobic. Logic is not transphobic. It might be incendiary because that's how you
No,
experience it.
I'm not suggesting facts are, but I think the way in which you discuss anything can be, regardless of whether you're being honest. Like you can be brutally honest with whomever about whatever, but there is a time and a place, and frankly,
That was a
and
time and a
actually
place, but that was a time and a place.
there's an approach that you can take to not being a dick, regardless of whether you have essentially. And that's the thing. He didn't have facts. He had pseudo facts. He
well,
wasn't even.
we don't know
Sure.
that because those
We
facts
know
were
that
never.
though.
Hold on. Those facts were never refuted on the show. So, in basically, if you were a person who
Yeah,
knew
but
nothing
he's a man
about,
of the world. He's not. He's not a child. He must have heard the arguments against his position. And
yeah,
that's
but the
part
point
of
of,
the problem is the cynicism, because I don't even think he really gives a fuck either way. He's just trying to stir up fucking clickbait nonsense. That's what that's his thing. It seems.
that may very well be true, and I would like to take this opportunity to ask this, Theryn. You said if you were on the show, you would have intellectually taken his arguments down. So now you're here. I want to know what you would have said to counter what Ben Shapiro's point was. No, I'm curious. Can you do that?
Yeah, I'm just so tired of but I'll do it. I have a video on it. I would recommend anyone to go watch it because I'm probably not going to say it as well as I'm saying it here. But his argument was because Caitlyn still has every chromosome in her body is still male, that he is going to refuse to call her he. And so in my video that everyone should go watch, I talk about one situation, intersex situation called complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, where people are born with XY chromosomes, but because they don't have any androgen receptors in their somatic cells, they develop completely female and they live their lives as women. They sometimes only realize that they have this condition once they reach puberty because they don't menstruate. So then they go to the doctor and they're like, "What's wrong?" And then they go do genetic testing and then they find out that they're genetically male. So, and my question is to Ben Shapiro: by your logic, you must call these women, who are so obviously women, so clearly women, you should call them but I doubt that that's what he will do. And then it kind of, his argument breaks down to, well, it's not about the chromosomes. It's more about how these two different, whether it be now Caitlyn Jenner or Zoe Tur, or whether it's these women with androgen insensitivity syndrome, it's not about whether they have these XY chromosomes, but how did they get from having XY chromosomes to living their lives as women. And conservative people don't like that whole messy bit in between. They don't like the fact that there was this big time where these people were living as male and that this person at one point had a penis. It doesn't have anything to do with XY chromosomes. They just don't like, it's like an appeal to nature fallacy. They don't like the whole unnaturalness of trans people. And that's really where it comes from.
So I would then, what it seems like, and I think that's a really good point that you make there. And if you were on the show, in let's say, in place of Zoe Tur, and you would have been able to stay, rational and just made that counter argument. And the thing is, I think everyone on the panel would have benefited from it. And even if Ben, because I mean, like, you have to also, I think, you understand that when you're discussing with people that hold opposing views, and you're having a discussion with them, generally you're not going to change that other person's mind. Like, Ben is not going to walk out of there and go, oh my God, I gotta go back and I gotta learn all this stuff over again. That's not likely going to happen because he's set in his ways. However, these discussions don't happen for the benefit of those people. They happen for the benefit of anyone who happened to be watching that either didn't know this information, or they were on the fence, or they, or maybe they were on the other side and they just hadn't seen enough evidence to show otherwise. Slowly but surely, we always make progress towards acceptance of people that are in marginalized groups, such as homosexuals, such as trans people, and so on. So but I think that the appeal to reason has to play the largest part, and I think that is I think that's why you're making a really good point. I would also ask this question, real quick. Do you think that we need another word, maybe, that's better than the word transphobia to describe what we're talking about? Do you think that may not be the best word? It may, because racism, for example, is pretty clear-cut in terms of how it works. But transphobia is a little less clear. Do you think that maybe we needed something else, like anti-trans, or I don't know? I'm not sure. I'm just trying to think here.
Well, at this point, I don't think racism is that clear-cut anymore either. Because, white people can't be racist. I mean, no, of course white people can't be racist.
They can't be victims of racism.
Yeah. And some people say
is this a room full of white people playing the victim now, is it?
No, I was just trying to say that it's not clear cut.
No, but when people make that point about, white people can't be the victim of racism, there's about a tiny slither of any population who would actually say or believe something so ridiculously absurd. And yet, unfortunately, a lot of people, and it's generally right-wing people, happy to sit there and play the victim as white people. Oh, black people can't be racist now. Oh, shut up. It's nonsense. Sorry, go on. I wasn't attacking you personally, but that sentiment annoys me.
That white people can't be victims of racism?
No, that white people will complain about the occasional, very unnecessarily politically correct person who will say something absurd like, black people can't be racist to white people. And it's a tiny percentage of them, an absolutely negligible percentage of people who would ever believe such an absurd claim. So it seems to me like white people playing the victim when they go on about that as if it's relevant.
I think it's relevant because... Kevin, can you mute yourself? Thanks. I think it's relevant because I think the people who believe those things are the ones who are most likely to hold positions in the media and things like that, and that does create the narrative. If you don't think white people can be victims of racism, and I know they can, I'm from South Africa, not trying to play the victim, I don't think, for the most part, white people aren't victims, but they can be victims of racism, just like any person. But these people who believe this these people in their fucking gender studies and ethnic studies and all of this progressive Marxist leftist crap that I am so tired of listening to on my campus. They go on to hold positions in the media and and they shape the narrative that we all hear. So yes, it's very much relevant. And moreover, yeah, yeah. Anyways, that was not my point. My point was more just that I don't think that even the term racist is that clear cut anymore. Like, you can't tell a person of color that you like their hair and then it's racist. Like, that's not racist.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of broadening of definitions of things that to create as much outrage in as many pockets of society as possible. So, I mean, I guess what I was, and I totally agree with what you're saying. I think that what I was getting at was, um, can something get used so often that it loses its meaning?
Oh yeah.
And then transphobia is one of those things, you know.
Totally. And I think most of it is not even nothing to do with transphobia. It's just ignorance. And I don't mean ignorance as in bigot, that term of ignorance, like you're a bigot. I just mean ignorance, like not having enough knowledge.
Well, yeah. I mean, I used to live in a neighborhood here in Chicago. We call it Boys Town, and because it has a very high population of lesbian, bi, queer, and trans people. And I never had exposure to trans people before then. And when I did, it was also, it was very strange to me because I had never seen it. I was much younger too, and it just took some time to acclimate. And I was like, okay, now I get it, you know. So, I mean, and that's the advantage of living in a big city like Chicago, because the rest of the state is like farmland and pretty, like redneck area. And I think that trans people would do a lot more poorly in those places than in the city.
Yeah, that's what I was actually going to say earlier when Theryn brought up the point of people who were ignorant and her talking to them, and eventually sort of they work out that she's not something to be scared of or whatever. And that seems to me, like you say, the advantage of living in a bigger city is that when you meet people of different races and sexualities and all the rest of it, you actually work out, well, they're just like me, but there's that one big difference, and that's it. But there's nothing to be scared of. They're not, it's that othering that you can do when you've never met a gay person or a Muslim or a transgender person or whatever.
I agree.
I'm getting an echo still from Kevin again, but is there anything else you guys want to bring up?
Well, to bring it back to the point I initially asked Theryn about, and I don't think I got an answer particularly, was why she just defines herself, and I think you define yourself as a men's rights activist, do you not?
Yeah. Yep.
Within a community of people that I've certainly experienced be very, very transphobic in the past. It seems it's picked very strange bedfellows.
Because, well, from my experience, and I have a YouTube channel now, I have been posting a few videos, and about 6 now, and there is the odd, is this a kind of comment of like, is this a dude, just the kind of either ignorant or just outright transphobic. I wouldn't say that was transphobic. But for the most part, it's either like, keep doing what you do, you're gorgeous, this is the first time I've been attracted to a trans person, and it might be because of the things you say, and just like that's the common reaction that I get from people who watch my videos. So I don't know.
Well, that's fantastic that your experience on your channel is that way. And by the way, I don't usually give shout outs to people who are of a very different political persuasion, but I watched your videos today and yesterday, knowing this was coming up, and I did actually learn quite a few things. So I would advise people to go and watch those videos actually. But I think in general, the men's rights movement, I've noticed, outside of maybe the people who watch your videos, are at least, at the very least, incredibly ignorant, and at some points belligerently transphobic.
Okay, well, the incredibly ignorant doesn't bother me. I don't care if people are incredibly ignorant. That means I have an opportunity to impart knowledge to them. And then the belligerent, I just think they're a lot of them are just they're the loudmouth minority. They're the ones who go out to go comment on the video that is about a trans person. It's hi fucking ugly tranny or whatever. So I don't know. I think that's kind of skewed. And yeah, as I said, I have experienced transphobia on like men's rights forums or whatever. And there's definitely a lot of transphobia in the pickup artist community, and I'm not going to start there. Luckily, I don't. They're not part of the men's rights movement. But there is this overlap, right? So you would often find people who may identify as pickup artist or whatever, or just a right-wing anti-feminist. Not necessarily anyone who actually cares about men's rights. So all of this overlap. So that also plays in, and the fact that these people are really loudmouthed and vocal, and the fact that a lot of them aren't actually transphobic, they're just ignorant, and they think that having a war against trans people is having a war against progressive leftism, where that is not the case. And I feel it's my job as a trans MRA to tell these people who are just ignorant, that's not the case. You don't have to hate trans people at the same time of hating the left or the progressive left, or feminism or whatever. You can and so yeah. I think I don't. And so even if every men's rights activist was a belligerent transphobe, I would still care about men's rights, and I would still do the things that I do in everyday life, and I would still have my club, and I would still make videos.
Theryn,
yeah.
do you also, because I also see that there's transphobia in the feminist movement as well, isn't there? Because there's a lot of
there's the TERFs, the trans exclusionary radical feminists.
Yeah, but I'm not. This might be the Kevin. Sorry.
Go ahead.
I keep on hearing myself. I'm actually, maybe I'll stand. Well, in one way, I'll stand up for feminism. First time ever. You're never going to hear me do this ever again. But they are, for the most part, quite accepting of trans people. Now, I think they give trans people the wrong tools and the wrong tactics completely, but at least for the most part, they're not trans exclusionary. And yes, there are TERFs. I haven't. The only TERF that I've online kind of exchanged with is Man Cheese, and everybody hates her. Shout out to Man Cheese. So yeah, I would say, although feminism is kind of accepting of trans people, they kind of give them the wrong tool bag of how to deal with them being trans and how to deal with the world. So it's yeah.
Oh no, I hate getting into labels because it just sounds like we're talking about these groups like they're homogenous blobs that all kind of follow, and we know that like they may share ideas, but they're not. You know, they're ultimately we're looking at, if we look at feminists, if we look at TERFs, if we look at MRAs, if we look at pickup artists, we're looking at individuals for the most part. I mean, they may share ideas and stuff. But like that brings about something interesting that you brought up. You said that I think that feminists do care a lot about trans issues. I think a lot of MRAs do as well, especially because you have women or men transitioning into women that are looking for a place of support for that, and we've on Honey Badger Radio have done a couple shows about it, and we've had trans people on, whether they were MRAs or not, just to talk about their experiences. But I think that you have like what I believe is a loud minority that often dominates the talking points of both sides, or any number of sides. Like a lot of times we would say people who are against progress must be conservative, right-wing people, you know, and that I think that the majority of people on the right are indifferent. But the loudest voices, like the Ben Shapiro types, you know, they're the ones
Yeah.
that dominate the conversation, or they appear to have the face of that. But on the other hand, you mentioned, and I think this is a really interesting point, that the people, a number of men's rights activists or people who are on that side of the discussion, even if they're PUAs, that may be ignorant about trans people, are doing that because they are afraid, or they assume that those trans people are, you know, part of the progressive left, because that is one of the many sort of like fronts or, you know, forces that you usually see, just like, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, or the, you know, the LGBT activists, you know, and they see that as part of that, and it's almost like it's another enemy, or another foe, another other, as it were, as you put it. Do you think that it's possible also that feminism, and again, I know I'm speaking about the blob, not the individuals, uses those groups as to help them, because, you know, they've been talking about things like intersectional feminism and the kyriarchy, and, you know, that kind of thing, and then it helps to it could be one of the reasons why you say that trans people sometimes have the wrong tools, that they may be used as political leverage, essentially. Do you think that that's
Absolutely,
possible?
absolutely. They're used as political leverage. They're pawns. Uh, oftentimes, uh, they oftentimes get swept up. As I said in the beginning, they get swept up by all this politics in a time of kind of vulnerability. And as I said, I don't think feminism is good for trans people, but they are at least accepting of trans
Well,
people. And it's a big no-no to not be accepting of trans people in the feminist community. It's a big no-no.
this is a point, just not to break up this little sort of right-wing loving that seems to be occurring here. The progressive left, if that's what you want to call us, what do you think it is, if we're just using them as a front, if we're just using them for political capital? Why is it, do you think, that LGBT people and trans people and minorities, by and large, are seemingly on our side if we're just using them?
I didn't say you just use them. I think.
Well, no, well, okay. Well, you didn't say anything other than. So I mean, yeah, you didn't
Well, I
exclusively.
did. I said that they're accepting. And if you're accepting, other people will be welcomed into your movement. I outright said that they're accepting. Obviously, they're accepting, so people will be accepted, and therefore they will come in. But I don't think that they just accept trans people so that they can give them, you know, their tools, and they send them out to the world to be political pawns. I don't think so, but I do think to a great extent that is what happens. Sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, on my university campus, very, very much so. Anyways.
I wanted to ask something else too. Oh yeah. Okay, so somebody mentioned something to me in chat that I thought was kind of interesting. They said that if we are living in a time where to criticize a trans person, or to be curious even, because that's like where I think Theryn's going, where she says, you know, sometimes the term transphobia or transphobic gets tossed around so easily that it's basically like a watered down definition. And so a person that's even just sort of like questioning it, or they may say, you know, they may use the word tranny, which some people would just think of as just a shorter version of it, and some people would think is very insulting. And we're just, you know, we're working it out. We're just talking it out right now to see what's what. If we then have decided as a collective, as a culture, that to question someone's gender as a trans person is transphobia and therefore insulting, does that not also invite trolls, essentially, people who are looking for a way to get under the skin of someone to question their gender? Because it seems to be like, like is, for example, in your case, Theryn, is the fact that you're a trans person the most sensitive aspect of who you are? Does it so define you that that is the way that people can get to you? Or do you have other things that basically are just part of the human experience that you can also be affected by? But then your being a trans person is the most low-hanging fruit, so it makes it easy for people to use it against you in a space where anonymity and being anonymous, it gives people the advantage, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, there are many things that people probably could kind of get to me with but they wouldn't know what it is, and me being trans is obviously the most obvious way, as you said. And yes, I think every trans person will say there is some part of their identity that it's a really sensitive topic. Like, there is sensitivity around it. So I agree with you that that's often the reason that trans people face transphobia, because maybe they don't like what you're saying or they don't like your tactics, and then they use you being trans as the most obviously visible way of getting to you. Is that what you were asking? I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, I was just sort of like, because I think that a lot of times when we see experience things like racism, homophobia, transphobia online, for example, on the internet sphere, it's mostly, I think, and there's really no way to know this for sure, and I'm not even saying to say it comes from a specific group, I'm just talking about individuals. It's usually coming from people that are trying to find a way to piss you off. And if the only thing that they can see is the lowest hanging fruit, which is, the fact that you might be gay, or the fact you might be trans, or the fact you might be Puerto Rican, like me, if they're going to use that, it's basically like it just makes it easiest for them to do so. And I don't know that it really, but because of that, though, at least for me, because I've had racial slurs thrown at me before, I don't think that those people I think they're just doing it because they want to see if they can affect me, and I think that I don't know, I take it as personal responsibility to not allow myself to be affected.
I agree. So, I think that's very good point. Yeah, I also try to make it as much of my responsibility as I can. And I think if that is true, as you said, you can't say for sure, but I think one could at least assume that a good deal of such instances is, in fact, it is true that it's not that they're just doing it because they suspect that is what's going to get a rise out of you, or that's what's going to be most incendiary. That's not indicative of anything. That's not indicative of some large structure.
Well, I have absolutely nothing to add to this conversation, because as a white straight man, what can you pick at me?
Mangina?
Mangina, yeah. Well, actually, that's a very, very good point. How do you get on with the incredible flippancy with which the word mangina is used? Because that in of itself is, it might not be actively transphobic, but it certainly seems sort of slightly ignorantly so, if that makes sense.
I think it's a really stupid word. I think it doesn't add anything to a conversation, and it doesn't, yeah, as I said, it doesn't add anything to a conversation, and it doesn't make any kind of a progress. It's so unsubstantial. With regards to, I don't think it has anything to do with trans people.
Well, no, it's
maybe it would have something to do with trans people if I were called a mangina. But the other day someone called me a mangina, and I told them I'm not even a man, and they were like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that."
No, I meant in terms of the sort of hybrid of man and vagina, which is obviously what that word means. There's certainly an overtone there. Even if it's not necessarily used in that way, I think there's an uncomfortable overtone or undertone, I suppose. But
I suppose.
But yeah, like I was only sort of interjected because I hadn't spoken for a hell of a long time. I can't really add anything because I'm not of any kind of racial or sexual minority. So I mean, other than being slightly chubby, there's nothing you can go after me for in terms of my physical exterior, you know.
I don't know. Feminists seem to go after men for simply being men. They say, "Shut up, stop mansplaining," or whatever. I see that all the time.
That's not for being men. That's for being condescending. Mansplaining isn't just you're a man. You can be a female who does mansplaining in that sense. I don't think that's true. But I've certainly seen.
Well, being a whiny man baby, I see that all the time. People,
yeah, and that's how I would define a lot of the men's rights movement. Frankly, it's childish lashing out.
Because it's, for the most part, when I see feminists talking about. Could you mute yourself again, Kevin?
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
When I see people saying whiny man babies, it's when men give their side of the story or try to be heard. But because they're men and they're talking about their own issues, they're like, never mind, you're just a whiny man baby. You're not allowed to talk about your own issues. You should be talking about women's issues, or someone else can be talking about your issues for you. But you can't talk about your own issues. That is when I see it being thrown around, and it's just a way of invalidating. It's the most obvious way of invalidating the human experience and the male experience, and I see it on my campus all the time, and I'm so fucking tired of it. I'm so tired of men being told to shut the fuck up when they talk about this because they're so fucking privileged. I'm so tired of it, and I get told that too. Because I talk about men's issues, I need to shut up.
I have to say the same about being called a mangina or a cuck or whatever by men's rights activists because I dare to have some other opinion. It's not to say that it's only men that suffer that. I think I've suffered a hell of a lot of that, and it's been mainly men that have done it too, mate.
Well, what it seems to me then is that there is language that's used in this whole discussion about gender on all sides by all kinds of people who don't know how to argue, essentially. Because if somebody says they call you a cuck, or they call you a mangina, or a white knight, or they accuse you, they say that you're mansplaining, or they call you a whiny piss baby, and they say, well, your male tears taste like honeysuckle. They have nothing to contribute in terms of arguments. It's the same thing as grabbing someone by the small of their neck and saying, you cut that out now, or you're going to be going home in an ambulance. It doesn't matter who it's coming from. None of it is useful because you're not making any progress towards greater understanding. And that's one of the things that we're trying to change, is basically talking openly and allowing these things to take place. And yeah, I mean, I don't think that you should get called that. I mean, but other people, they're going to do, because they're free-thinking beings, they can do whatever they want. But I don't find it to be very useful for engaging in conversation. And I've also been told to shut up because I'm a man, because I have an opinion, and I don't think that's an individual's needs to have learned experience to have an opinion on something.
Well, my whole point is not that inherently feminism is perfect or spotlessly clean in this regard at all, because it isn't. Unfortunately, there are some that will, the male tears thing or the kill all men hashtag. There is some fucking stupid shit that goes around.
Some is an understatement.
Well, no, but my point is that if you go around virtually all of the sort of male spaces, the MRM manosphere spaces, they're fucking riddled with the most disgusting bigotry. They're riddled with the anti-male bigotry. Anti-male people who, trans people or people like me who dare to have a dissenting voice, or effeminate men, or just men they don't like, or whatever. It's by and large, I would suggest that feminism is far, far more accepting. than the MRM in any number of different ways, as you conceded certainly with trans people anyway.
I actually appreciate trans people like the MRM more in that regard, at least in the sense that they value logic and reason. So I can persuade them through logic and reason. I can't persuade, I can't find that I can persuade feminism or feminists of anything using logic, reason, and evidence. I get called a misogynist. I get called...
Well, no, but you don't need to convince anyone well, not anyone, other than the TERFs. You don't need to convince anyone that you're a woman within feminism. That's accepted.
Yeah, but that's good enough for me. It's not good
No, I'm
enough.
not saying it is good enough, but my whole point is, why the hell would you be part of a movement who so utterly wish to undermine, either ignorantly or actively undermine, your very gender? Because
I don't understand. They don't. Did I not tell you that nobody on my YouTube, except for a few people, have been transphobic? They've been super positive and
on your channel. But I go and watch some of my videos. You get people saying about Zoe Torres, a video I did a couple of weeks ago, with a guy going on about oh, it's a man in a dress. It's a man in a dress. It's disgusting.
Yeah, I see that all the time too.
But
have you given him a good argument for why it's not a man in a dress, or did you just say, "Oh, that's disgusting"? Like.
I don't care to argue with a man who is outwardly a bigot. That's bigotry. That's not just ignorance. I don't have to give that man an argument because he's an idiot. I'm sorry. I'm not going to waste my fucking time on people like that. I'm just going to mock them and move on because that's what I do. I'm not. This idea that you can only ever do anything with oh, it has to be rational. It has to be real. No, I'm sorry. Sometimes some people are just beneath refutation. They're just so beneath it.
Well, maybe I am more understanding of the fact that being trans is hard to understand for most people. You just say they better accept it. They just need to understand. They don't even really need to understand. They just have to accept what authority says. You know, the authoritarian left, or whatever you want to call it. Doesn't even have to be the left. Just trans people as an authority. You just have to believe them. And people like that refuse to do that.
No,
I refuse
not,
to believe that that is a woman. That is a man in a dress.
I'm not asking that people accept the authoritarian left, whatever the fuck that even means. What I'm suggesting is that science has fairly conclusively proven this, and society has mostly accepted it. So ultimately, if you're still belligerently going to stick to the he's a man in a dress thing, then you're a piece of shit. That's my whole.
Society has not accepted it.
End of my argument.
Society has not accepted it.
Most moderate people, at the very least, wouldn't be outwardly aggressively transphobic to people. They've accepted it essentially it's mostly
commenting on a video and saying, "Sorry, he's a man in a dress," is not outwardly aggressive. I mean, that's not even directly towards Zoe Tur. That's just making a comment on a video saying, "I don't believe that this is a woman." I don't see how that is outwardly aggressive, not able to rationalize with, or scum of the earth hateful. I don't get it.
I was suggesting that most people aren't outwardly aggressive. I think most people in society are at least moderately accepting, even if they don't even understand the damn thing about it. They accept that there's nothing inherently wrong going on there, and they just get on with their lives. They're basically entirely ignorant, and sort of, I suppose, happily ignorant of any issue.
Not from my experience. Most people don't get transgenderism at all.
That's my point. Yeah, I'm not suggesting they've accepted it from a position of understanding. They've essentially just accepted that it's a thing. It's just a thing that happens to other people, but they're not hateful towards trans people by and large.
Why is someone in a comment section saying?
It wasn't in the comment section. He made a video of his own, which I was responding to.
Okay, I misunderstood. But
no, that's fine.
Regardless, do you mind muting your thing
Sorry, yeah.
again?
It's okay.
But regardless, I'm kind of skeptical because he might accept that there are trans people, but he's not going to accept from his knowledge that they are women, because from how he understands male and female, it obviously doesn't make sense to him. That doesn't mean that doesn't, I don't know, like obviously he still understands and accepts the fact that there are trans people and that it's a thing. That doesn't mean an opinion of it is necessarily that they're women or whatever. From his knowledge and what he's gathered, he's like, I'm sorry, that is not a woman. And I don't see how that is hatred. I think it's ignorant, but I don't see how he's a bigot. I'm sorry. That's kind of hard for me to get to. He's a bigot.
All right, I want to. I've been observing the conversation, and it looks like what we're looking at here is we're both sides, MRAs and feminists, have experienced negative commentary from the other, and they are aware that there is negativity on their own side as well. So, Kevin, you acknowledge that there are subgroups within feminism and feminists that are, they can be pretty crappy towards men, towards MRAs. And then Theryn acknowledges that there are people in the men's rights movement. We've seen it too, because, again, we are looking at individuals that can say nasty things, that can be pretty destructive and not helpful. And this is the reason why I think that these fireside chats are so important, because we are experiencing similar things, and I think that in a lot of ways we want similar things too. And all of this noise, this background noise, it gets in the way. But we also want to be reasonable. We also want to look at all sides. It's like you can't really complete an equation without having all of the variables. We want to look at all the variables and see what the equation is like. And I'm only saying this because I think I respect you both, to be honest, and I like to hear both sides of this conversation so that we're on the same page. I think. Do you guys see what I'm saying? Do you agree?
I agree, and I think that this is kind of an unproductive conversation because it's like, oh, well, from my experience, the MRM is transphobic and hateful, and then I, an actual trans person, I'm like, no, not really. It's kind of here and there. Some people are hateful, some people are just ignorant, and some people are like really super positive and accepting. So it's all like anecdote, and we're not getting to the meat of it. So
what is okay? Let's do that. What's the meat of it? What do we want to know? Let's forget anecdotes. Let's try to get to the idea. What are we looking at here?
In terms of trans people?
I'm not sure. I thought that you had some things written down, or
I do have some things written down. I told Kevin that I'd like to talk about why I'm not a feminist, why I'm an MRA.
I think that's a really good start. Why don't you?
Okay.
Yeah, why don't you tell us why you're not a feminist and you're an MRA? And do you think that trans people who take up political activism, do you think which camp do you think that they tend to lean towards?
So I'll start with kind of talking about why I've come to knock it, because there was a time where I did consider myself a feminist and kind of, I guess, a progressive, and I was super into social justice activism and everything, especially mostly on my campus. And then when I realized there's a lot of misandry going around, and it's kind of normalized and kind of just accepted, and if you question it, you're kind of labeled as a misogynist or whatever. That's when I kind of distanced myself. But I kind of want to draw a comparison, or kind of to explain why I'm not a feminist, and because of the way feminists seem to view men and how they view women. So a few years ago, I got mugged at knife point while I was walking in the woods outside my house in South Africa. Luckily, I was okay, but my phone and my wallet was stolen, but I wasn't like stabbed or anything. I was just very traumatized. And like, given kind of the racialized climate in South Africa, the fact that I was mugged by two men of color obviously didn't go like unnoticed to my subconscious, whatever. And then, like, when you go through kind of traumatic experiences like this, your brain tries to make kind of sense of the whole situation and tries to figure out how to avoid such a situation in the future. That, combined with the fact that most humans have natural tendencies toward tribalism along racial lines, it created like a perfect situation where I had the potential to develop kind of racist attitudes. Luckily, I didn't, because kind of with a front of the brain conscious effort, I could avoid that. And obviously racism wasn't accepted in like my environment and everything, so it wasn't validated. And obviously I kind of made a conscious effort to say, even though I was horribly traumatized and our brain kind of has that tendency to do that, I kind of avoided it. But imagine that at this time of my traumatic experience, there was like a racial ideology equivalent to feminism that I could turn to, and it validates my traumatic experiences by telling me that I was a victim of like an organized societal oppression of white people, or whatever, that it's not all black people are like this, but the average black person is like this because the system allows them to get away with it, or for it to be so. If there were a movement that exploited my emotional state like that and validated my anecdotes as evidence of a larger structure that oppresses me, I'd be a rampant racist. So yeah, it's not that feminism even states that all men are rapists or that all men are misogynists, but in everything they say and do, it's clear that they're talking about the average man, and the average man and the masculinity that the average man exhibits is toxic and problematic. So, I mean, look at the bogus 1 in 4 rape statistic. You must have a horrible view of the average man if you take that stat at face value, which is what pretty much every feminist does. So yeah, in my mind, and if you look at, like, from the feminists I've met, they've been victims of rape, they've had really bad self-image or some insecurities or stuff. It seems to me like feminism seems to target women who've had bad experiences with men and tell them you are justified to feel this way about, if not all men, at least the average man. That's why I'm personally not a feminist in terms of how feminism seems to view men. In terms of women, I mean, have you ever watched like curling, the sport? I see feminists as them treating women like those curling balls that they throw, like, and then society is just like the players that are like rampantly and frantically like brushing the ice in front of the ball, in front of the block, so that there's as little friction as possible, so that they can just move in a straight, effortless line, and that's how feminists seem to treat women, or want society to treat women, that women don't have to do or can't do anything. They're just this inert block that just has to move in like a straight, unintervened line, and everyone around them should just make the friction that they experience as little as possible and zero obstacles, and that's just such a demeaning view of women. So that's why I'm not a feminist, because of how they view women as curling blocks, or whatever you call it, those things that they throw. And
stones.
They're called stones?
They're called stones, yes.
Okay, the stones.
I believe. Well, you're in Canada. You should know this, surely. But anyway, what was I going to say?
I don't like sports.
Well, okay. Well, I only watch it when the Winter Olympics is on, anyway. You seem to be misusing the phrase toxic masculinity, as I think a lot of MRAs do. When we say, well, certainly when I say toxic masculinity, we don't mean all masculinity is toxic. We're saying within masculinity there is a strain of toxicity, and that's what we wish to challenge. We're not trying to demonise all masculinity by saying it's all toxic.
No, no, no. I know that feminists don't demonize all masculinity. They demonize the average masculinity. The masculinity that society says it is okay for you to be that way, and that is toxic. That is what's toxic. So obviously,
Well, there are elements of that.
The average man is problematic, and I don't believe that. I don't believe the average man exhibits bad masculinity. I think masculinity is a good thing. I think most of masculinity is a good thing, and the masculinity exhibited by the average man is healthy masculinity, not fringe, not like toxic. That's what I'm saying. Is that you're saying this? Maybe not you, but feminists are saying this about the average man, not all men, but the average man. And it's obvious.
I think what feminists are saying is not that the average man is inherently some sort of horrific misogynist, but that when average men, and especially young men, I can attest to this, when you do stray into those toxic areas of masculinity, unfortunately society doesn't do anything to slap down on that behaviour as it would with a number of relatively kind of minor bits of femininity. Especially when it comes to areas of sexual promiscuity, for instance, or sexual harassment. It doesn't. Society, by and large, seems to essentially ignore or condone those kind of. I'm not talking about just say like rape or anything like that. Even sort of relatively minor, lower level stuff like catcalling or over persistent, coming onto them in a bar or whatever. Society just completely ignores that, as if that isn't a problem.
It's not society's job, though. It's the woman's job to say, fuck off. Stop treating women like they have no agency. Like, oh my god.
No. My point is, we all, as a society, have a role to play in policing.
No.
Social policing one another, in the sense that when someone's being a dick, they don't necessarily know it. So if you say you're being a dick, you can actually, in some senses, draw those kind of social boundaries much more clearly.
Why is it everyone around women? Why is it everyone around women's job to do the job that's so obviously theirs? That if they don't like what's happening to them, to tell them to stop.
Because they don't fucking stop, do they? That's the point. It's not just. I'm not trying to remove the individual agency from any woman, all right? But I'm saying that every single person, be they male or female, has a duty of care in some capacity to every other person. We live in a civilization. You're not an independent person completely. That doesn't work.
Well, especially according to feminist attitude towards women, women are especially not individuals capable of controlling their environment or saying no. Like, look at how they treat rape nowadays. It's not that it's women's responsibility that when something's happening during sex that they don't like, to say, hey, I don't like that, can we stop? No, it's the man's job to ask them and to say after every single thing that happens, are you okay? As if there's just these bags of sand just lying there, like sex.
I think that's a straw
lying
man.
there, not being able to do anything.
I think that's a straw man position of some extreme feminists. I don't think
Absolutely
most feminists
not. It's absolutely
most
not
feminists
a straw man.
do not see sex in that way at all. And of course, women have the agency at whatever point to say, stop. I don't want to continue this, or I don't want to do this or that or whatever. Of course they do. And to bring it back to your curling analogy of essentially being used, in a sense, the men's rights movement constantly use men's issues as a stick to essentially beat women with or to complain about. But what do they actually do about that? It seems to me like they're using men's issues as a front and actually
I never
actively working as an impediment to any change happening.
I didn't use it as. Could you mute that again, please? Thank you. I didn't say that women were being used. My analogy was that women can't do anything, and it's everyone around them's responsibility to do it for them, so that they can move in this perfectly streamlined line just through life, like these inert stones, as it's apparently called, it's not about being used.
And to comment about what the MRM actually accomplishes, you know that the main thing that stands in the way of the MRM accomplishing much of anything is feminism, right? I mean, that is like the largest obstacle.
Absolutely, and from my experience, yes, like my club application, it took months and months for a club to be approved because it had to go through the Women's Center, the only club in the history of ever needing to go through the Women's Center. And then there was more barricading our approval for like no good reason. They literally went on Wikipedia, the Wikipedia page of Cafe, and went and cited reasons on Wikipedia not to approve us. And I actually went and I looked at the sources of Wikipedia, and it's all a load of crap. But they didn't bother. They were just grasping at reasons to not approve us. And don't tell me that we're not doing anything. I find that horribly irritating, because I'm working my fucking ass off. We have an event on missing and murdered Indigenous men and boys next Friday, and then Tuesday thereafter we have Men's Issues 101 here in Vancouver. So, and I am the MRM. Oh, that sounds a bit cocky, but I am part of the MRM. So don't tell me, oh, but the MRM isn't doing anything. You're doing something, but the MRM isn't. I am part of the MRM.
Yeah, I didn't say every MRM is doing nothing. I mean, a lot of the leading organisations raise issues and do very little about them, it seems to me. That's not to say no MRMs are doing anything, and there's no need to get angry about it. That seems a bit over the top, really. I'm not suggesting that you don't do activism or that you don't face.
Because I'm tired of it, Kevin. I'm tired of it. I'm tired of people like you telling us that we don't do anything. Just because you don't hear about it, just because the media doesn't cover the issues that we raise, just because when Dan Parents runs like, how far did he run? But he was doing like a marathon, was he? No, I'm sorry, he was.
He did a walk.
Yes, and he wasn't eating or something. No media coverage. We are doing things. We are doing things all the time, and we are doing the best with the tools that we have. We don't have a shit ton of funding like feminist organizations do. We don't have a lot of media coverage because people tend not to really care very much. So I'm sorry that I got angry, but I'm getting very impatient with people telling me we don't do much.
Well, there's also Earl Silverman, who had been working really hard to try to open a men's shelter, and he never could. He ended up committing suicide because he ran into so many problems trying to get it done.
But didn't Karen already tell Kevin this?
Yeah, I mean, I think so, but I'm just sort of like reiterating it in case anyone.
I know, but why do I have to remind Kevin that we are doing stuff? Kevin, why aren't you listening to us when we say that we are doing stuff?
I didn't say that nobody's doing anything.
You said the MRM isn't doing anything. We are. Oh, God.
Well, do you guys want, you know what, we've been going for like an hour and a half, and I think that we should, because once the videos get too long, we don't get as many people listening. And I would like to, but let's get some closing thoughts. Would you guys be willing to come back and do another show?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. Do you guys have any closing thoughts about you guys want to say to each other or to anyone who happens to be listening?
I think that. Oh God. No, closing thoughts. The men's rights movement obviously isn't perfect, but we've done a lot more for men than feminism has ever done for men. 100 and what years of putting men's issues on the back burner, and still putting their issues on the back burner, even though there are so many incredibly serious things going on that really need to be addressed. So yeah, there's a lot of imperfection, and we were talking about this yesterday. Alison was talking about this yesterday, about how feminism seems to care first and foremost about themselves, about women. Like, I don't care if the MRM has some strain of transphobia, because it's not about me. This is about men and boys. This is what I care about. It's not all about me. I'm not, and I, yeah, so that is all I wanted to say. And thanks for the great conversation.
Kevin, do you want to say a few words?
Just my closing remarks would be for Theryn and for whomever to ponder upon the fact that the men's rights movement, regardless of what they may or may not be doing, what they're certainly doing is the extremism that gets, and it may only be a certain number of them, it may only be a certain percentage of them, but the extremism that gets exposed by certain leading figures within that movement and within the online debate or the online discussion within the MRM stops any actual mainstream progress from being made on the issues that the MRM claim to care about.
All right. Well, guys, thank you. I'm getting a little echo. Hold on. Thanks for both of you coming out. Theryn, thank you, Kevin. Those of you who are in the comments section, please leave us your thoughts. Let's, if you have anything that you want to add or any like data that you might have access to, anybody here, please share it in the comments section. Let's try to move towards some degree of enlightenment. So, and yeah, thank you, Theryn, again. Thank you, Kevin. And thank you, listeners. If you like the work that we do here, please go to our Patreon and consider donating. That's patreon.com/honeybadgerradio. And yeah, have a good afternoon and a good weekend.